Ladies and gentlemen, do you want to build the console-beating gaming PC, but you still want to save a little bit of money? Well, if that's you, then you're in the right place, because today we're going to be putting together a kick-ass gaming PC on a modest budget, but something that is going to be able to do pretty much everything. And throughout this video, we're going to show you all of the components that we have, including the RTX 4070, now with a recent price drop. We'll be walking you through everything we like about this system, and maybe some things that we'd change. And of course, we'll show you those all-important gameplay benchmark numbers, so you can see exactly how this thing performs. So join us as we walk you through this balls-of-the-wall kick-ass gaming PC right after a short word from this video sponsor. NZXT's Function 2 keyboard brings beauty to your desk with an eye-grabbing design that is perfect for gaming. Featuring linear NZXT Swift optical switches, you get super fast key actuation that can even be customized in software to match your personal preferences. Throw in gorgeous RGB lighting, hot swappable switches, and double-shot PBT keycaps into the mix, and you've got the complete package. It comes in both black or white, and full size or mini 10 keyless. Grab yours today with the link down below. Okay, in a nutshell then, this is what I would describe as your sort of upper mid-range build. We've got an NVIDIA RTX 4070 graphics card. This is going to be great for 1440p and even a fair bit of 4K gaming, but with the recent price drop, you can now find these for around about £500 or so, which is still a lot of money, especially bearing in mind you can buy an Xbox One, oh, that was a while ago, an Xbox Series X for around about £430 or so. But obviously, when you factor in that this is a gaming PC, can do so much more than just play games, to a lot of people, that is going to be worth the money and then some. Now, the first thing that I actually want to take this opportunity to do, though, is to walk you through this case. And I've literally just seen this for the first time after taking it out of the box. It's got a really catchy name, actually. It's called the NX416L, but this is just about to release. It should cost around about £80 or so here in the UK, but I would wager that give this like a month or two and you'll probably be able to sort of get this for nearer the £60–65 mark. You've got USB Type-C on the front, but sadly only one USB-A. That actually to a lot of people is going to get annoying. And I think this is on a hinged door. Yes, there we go. Pops out a little bit as well. These screws need tightening up. That's the sign of quality. Not to worry though, all is well. I mean, you definitely can tell that corners have been cut, but I'd say that if you are trying to save yourself a fair bit of money, you want to spend that extra £40 on a more expensive GPU that, let's be honest, will give you much better gaming performance and obviously a much better over experience, then that probably is a trade-off that's worth going for. So just this bit really that feels a little bit cheaper, and you also don't have much in the way of cable management grommets. So you've got this sort of shield here, but that's not actually for cable management. This is if you do want to use that side ventilation. This should just pop out. Non-captive screws for the back, but it's been what now, like 2 minutes into talking about this chassis, and I think we've already kind of sussed this out because it comes with features with things like ARGB fans, and large ones actually on the front, and then this smaller 120 on the back. ARGB hub as well, which is great for adding extra fans and keeping everything on sort of one controller, nice and easy to organize, cable management, all of that good stuff. But it is quite clear that you're sort of losing a little bit of raw quality from the case itself as a result of those extra features for that same price point. I wouldn't say that this is a problem as long as you're aware of them. And I will also say that while it sort of, I'd say it kind of feels like a mid-range case at the moment, as soon as you actually get your motherboard and graphics card in here and it all sort of tightens up, then the quality will definitely seem to improve a lot as well. That's very good timing. How can they have not fitted the screws for the door properly from the factory? What is that all about?
Oh, this is going to be the best gaming PC ever. Oh.
This is why we review the stuff as we go. I use a spare screw, don't worry, it's all good. Regardless of the chassis that you have, the first thing really that you actually need to do to begin your journey is to grab your motherboard and take it out of the box. So yes, this is a Z790 Steel Legend motherboard from Asrock. You can currently get this for like $220, $230 here in the UK. And usually I'd actually say, if you're sort of trying to save as much money as possible, go for a B series motherboard. You can't do any overclocking on the CPU, and the feature set isn't quite so good, but you can usually save a fair bit of money. But when you can get this motherboard, as I say, for that price, actually, this is probably the way I would go, especially if you are going to look to upgrade your sort of CPU at a later date, maybe to an i7 or an i9. or probably more likely, put as much power inside this thing as possible. Cooling dependent, of course. Now, we obviously could just stare at this motherboard all day, but practically speaking, we do need to actually get things started. And the first thing we want to do is to grab our CPU out of the box. This one is the latest 14th gen CPU from Intel. It is the i5-14600K. This has a total of 14 cores, and it's split between 6 performance cores, which are the good ones really that we can use for gaming, and then 8 efficiency cores. And the difference really between going for Ryzen and going for Intel is that this is sort of like a much better all-round chip, really. It will cost more, around about 90 to 100 pounds at the time of filming, more than the equivalent sort of Ryzen 5 7600 in terms of gaming performance, but as I say, it's going to be a much better all-round system, and it will actually outperform the 7600 by a decent margin as well. But obviously, if you want the absolute best gaming CPU, in my opinion, I would definitely go for the Ryzen 7 7800X3D, but that costs more money and you would need a different motherboard. But if you're interested in that, I'll leave links to everything and some other suggestions down below. But we do just want to grab our CPU and gently line this up so it sits in there nice and safe and secure. There is actually this little gold arrow here that should line up with an arrow on the motherboard itself. Yes, there we go, on this cover. I mean, to be fair, that used to be like a big thing. You've got to line it up with the arrow, but these days, like the modern Ryzen and Intel chips just go in like down like this, so it's very hard to get wrong. We're also going to need to grab ourselves some memory or some RAM, and this stuff is DDR5. Very important on the Intel platform because some motherboards will say D4 or DDR4, others will say D5, DDR5. They're completely different types of memory, so if you buy the wrong board or the wrong RAM, you will not be able to put your RAM inside and you will be very sad. But here we're using DDR5 because it is actually faster, and to be honest, it's not really that much more expensive if you want to go for 32 gig. And we're going to line this up with our slot here. This is some Kingston Fury RGB, and this will run at 5600 megahertz. But if you can buy a 6000 megahertz kit, that is what I would advise. This is the wrong way round. This is why you line it up first before you push it in. Oh, that's good noise, such good noise. Then you want to take the opportunity to pick up the screwdriver you just dropped on the floor. It will need to be slightly smaller for the SSD, but you just want to open it up by unscrewing these 2 screws, and then this whole heatsink should remove. And this, which is a Gen 4 SSD, is going to give you the best balance between speed and performance. This is the Crucial P3 Plus. It's a fan favorite. We've been using it on the channel for a while now. I think I bought this one myself last year or so. It's been pretty good ever since, but this just sits in the slot like that, folds downwards, and then you can proceed to grab this little heatsink cover. Make sure you do remove the plastic film that will be on this. I've used this board before, which is why it's not on there. Then just gently replace that and screw it back down. And then now, I think, comes the fun, or definitely the interesting bit, because this is a brand new, currently unreleased cooler that by the time you're watching this should have just come out. This is from Arctic. This is the Arctic Freezer 36 ARGB, so obviously it's going to be nice and bright and vivid. And it's a bit tricky actually with Intel, because it does like to use a fair bit more power. And the more power you can give it, then the better your performance will be, up until a limit. But I'm actually expecting very good things from this. Ooh, and ladies and gentlemen, this is why I say this is going to get interesting, because what we have here is an Intel contact frame. As we do know that the default contact frame that you get on the board itself probably could use a bit of improvement with some of the CPUs. So Arctic actually give you one of these straight outside, well, inside the box, not outside the box. You're gonna have to assemble it outside the box. And in order to do this, they will give you a little tool. It does sound very scary, but actually I've done this before and it really shouldn't be an issue. You just wanna make sure that your CPU is installed. Grab this little star-headed Allen key, I suppose it's called, and then just gently remove this. It might have been better actually to not have the latch down before doing that. But that comes off, and then the new and hopefully improved goes on. And you should then see that there is actually quite a, I was going to say substantial, it certainly looks very different, doesn't it, in the way that it presents the CPU through the frame itself. Let's now grab our 4 Intel screws that look a little bit like this and put these through the 4 holes. Do be very careful to make sure that you do screw down in a cross pattern though, because you really want to make sure you're putting even contact on the CPU. You don't want to dislodge it and you don't want to have it in there too tight. And I guess this will now just sit on top of our frame. Nice big contact point on the base of this. But of course, in order to actually get this to function properly, we will need to add some thermal paste. And we can just add a decent pea-sized amount in the middle. Then pick up our cooler for real this time and just gently lower that on top of the frame, and then once again screw it into position, but making sure to do the even force, this time left to right. I've just skipped ahead to try and work this out so I seem like an expert on camera, and I've got to admit, the way Arctic have designed this mounting system is fantastic, because not only was that CPU concept frame really easy to install and hopefully pretty efficient, but to actually get this on top of the cooler, we literally just have to push it. That's it. You can't get simpler than that. Seems nice and sturdy, isn't going to pop out until we want to actively remove it with a lot of force. So let's get both of these attached. Have I plugged the fans in wrong on this cooler? Give our motherboard a little spin so we can see what we're doing, and then we're going to need to daisy chain these cables together. So we have two addressable RGBs, and they can just plug in together, and then they connect to one of these grey headers at the top right of the board. You then want to do the same with the fan speed, and then connect it to the one that says CPU fan just above the cooler. And assuming now that nothing really goes wrong, that was actually the most difficult bit of your gaming PC complete. I mean, it's pretty much ready to go. All you need is a GPU to obviously output your gaming signal, and to actually get this inside your case and plugged in with the power supply. And the next bit should be fairly straightforward, as long as the case manufacturer has pre-applied these standoffs here, which they have. So this is what actually separates the motherboard from the case, so you don't get any shorts or anything like that, and it stands it up, hence why it's called a standoff. And you just grab your motherboard. Do make sure you're not getting any cables from this fan clamped. It tends to happen quite a lot, but just gently move this into position so all of your standoffs align. Then remember that you've absolutely cocked it up, and you should have actually got the screws outside of the case hard drive bay before you started, so you can screw it down. Assuming then you're not quite as silly as me, you should now have your screws ready to go, and you should just be able to fit this down. Once your motherboard is in position, you should have something that resembles this. I mean, so far so good. It is obviously a white and black motherboard, which isn't to everybody's tastes, but if you go for this case in white, I think it probably would fit in a little bit better, or if you're using like white or silver elements somewhere else. But while it's taking shape, it's not yet done, so you will need to grab these cables around the back and start to undo them. We've got our USB Type-C, we've got USB 3, HD audio, which is basically just analog audio for the front panel, and then we have these tiny little headers here that say power switch, which is the all-important one to make the button to turn it on actually do anything, power LEDs, and then HD LEDs. So this just shows the activity of your PC on the LEDs on the front. But you want to grab these cables and feed them through to where the sockets are on the other side, and then you can start plugging them in. So with this footage from earlier, you can see this is where the USB Type 3 is. Just above that, you've got your USB Type-C. At the bottom right, you've got your LEDs and your power switch. As you can tell though, these bits are always pretty fiddly as they're so tiny, so my recommendation is to always look in your motherboard manufacturer's manual just to see what pins you need to put where. It's not difficult, but it's very easy to get it wrong. We're going to plug our fan header in at the bottom left, our addressable RGB just next to it, and then all the way at the left, we have our HD audio. So as you can see then, for the most part, we're pretty much there. We just need to get our graphics card installed and our PSU. I'm going to do our graphics card first, just for a change really, but it doesn't really matter which way you do it. We just need to open up our side slots just by unscrewing this little piece on the side and then taking out the screws on slots 2 and slots 3. Obviously, if you're using a larger GPU, then it might need to be a little bit more than this. Take these covers out, and then I think we can proceed to what has to be the star of the show, the now cheaper RTX 4070, and cheaper is always better, right? It seems that this was better received because the same product for less rather than the super cards, which were, in the case of the 4080 Super, basically the same product but for less, but it was a new product, so people are like, why don't you just bring out something even better? That's a debate for a whole nother day. The fact that you can now get this for around about £500 or so, I'd say that it's still very expensive, but it's probably the cheapest NVIDIA card that I think everyone is going to be happy with. Now, if you go for an AMD graphics card, you will be getting better value for money, and I think something that's very important is 16 gigabytes of VRAM, so if you're playing at high resolution like 4K, that will definitely come in handy, but then you're not going to have those NVIDIA specific features like you have on this card. So I'd say this is probably, well, definitely is a fair bit more complete, but if you specifically just play multiplayer, then there are better cost per frame cards out there that will give you better value for money. But this is a card that can run ray tracing, and while it's not going to do it at 4K necessarily, for what most people are actually going to use this thing for, I think you're going to be really happy with the performance. But that just sits in there like that. tightens up, and then bar our power cables, that is our rig pretty much complete. I mean, it is starting to look like one of those really cool modern rigs now that won't have any power cables, but alas, that is not the case. And I've actually reached out to Corsair because I was having a little bit of a shortage of power supplies, but this is pretty much the one that comes up time and time again when I'm doing some e-shopping. I mean, I suppose all shopping's e-shopping these days. And speaking of E, this is also the RM750E. Maybe the E stands for efficiency. Not entirely sure, but you'll find that most manufacturers have actually updated their power supplies now with this ATX 3.0 or PCIe Gen 5 standard, which means if you are going to go for an NVIDIA card, it will come with that 16-pin cable connection, so you won't have to use a horrible adapter. 750 watts is also more than you need for this rig. I think you could get by with a 650, but I always recommend going a little bit above that just for longevity, as if you want to make any upgrades, then obviously you don't really want to have to swap out your power supply to make it work. But this is also a modular PSU, so you can see this is a Type 4 Corsair power supply if you want to use separate cables or something like that, but you don't have to plug in the cables you don't need, which means your whole rig will be a whole lot neater. Let's plug in our motherboard ATX. Do make sure they are definitely plugged in all of the way down, as when I was helping my friend Rob build his first PC. You can find that in the top right corner of your screen. One of the mistakes I saw he made was not actually having them plugged in all the way, but was adamant that they were. It's very easy to make, and that could mean that your system won't boot. This just goes in down the bottom with the fan facing downwards so it can breathe in from below. Then it screws in from the back. Then you just need to grab the cables, route them through, and plug them into their respective places. So once again, we've got our CPU at the top left of the motherboard. I've fed the cable for the graphics card from the bottom for neatness, but do make sure that you plug it in as tight as can be. You do need to hear that audible click with these cables to ensure they're in properly. And then last, but certainly not least, we have our very large ATX. I mean, if you missed this one, I'm sorry, but how? And I think that's almost our lot. We just need one SATA cable for the fan speed, and I haven't plugged that into the power supply, have I? And this is basically PC building in a nutshell. It doesn't matter how many times you do it, you usually forget something, or maybe I'm just an idiot, or both. I mean, cable management on this case, I mean, there's not really any, is there? I mean, it's fine for this, actually, because you don't really have many cables, so it's not so much of a problem. It's not going to win awards for the highest quality, most feature-rich thing in the world, but if you want a full airflow chassis, you want your RGB fans on the front and on the back, I think it's worth the money, just maybe not the exact launch price. But obviously now does come the time to actually see if this is going to work. And I realise that I've potentially made the gravest of errors, that if this happened to you, you would be the major sads. Because while this does support 14th gen CPUs, this particular motherboard, I have a feeling that the one I've got was a sort of launch review sample that was way before 14th gen even existed. And usually you would just do a BIOS update, which is pretty straightforward. You grab the new BIOS, you download it, put it on a USB drive on the back, push a button, wait for it to finish, hey presto, Bob's your uncle, you're away. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem as if this actually has that functionality. And I think for a £230, £240 motherboard, that is a disgrace. And unfortunately, I have to say, because of this, I would probably recommend going for a different motherboard, because if you don't get one that has this functionality, you could find that you're in this exact situation. And because motherboards are typically made like ages in advance, they might be sitting in a warehouse, you might find that you run into the same potential issue that we might have here. So I will leave some links to different motherboards down in the description below that are hopefully a safer bet. But that's why we do these videos. Or you could just go for a 13th gen CPU and save yourself some money. They're basically the same. But you never know. This could work first time. I think the odds are very low, but let's have a look. So we have like lights and signal, which is great, and this is what is to be expected. But until you actually have something that appears on the screen, I think it's safe to assume that... Have I plugged the fans in wrong on this cooler? I'm having a mad one. Look what I've done. How have I managed that? The fans are actually blowing the wrong way on this. Whoa! We have a signal! I don't believe it! I don't believe it! I was not expecting this at all. I swear the BIOS in this was old. Maybe I've updated it. How about that? Well, that's great, because that saved me a whole bunch of time messing around with a cooler. But because I've already got Windows installed on this SSD, it's pretty straightforward. It's just going to load into it. But chances are, if you're doing this for yourself, then you're not upgrading a prior PC. So you will need to grab yourself a copy of Windows 11. It's really easy. Just download it on another Windows like laptop or PC, put it on this USB stick with the installer, put it in the back of your system, and then when you actually restart your gaming PC, you should see like a similar screen and it will say install Windows. We made a full video about how simple this is. You can find it in the top right corner of your screen if you're interested. That walks you through the full process. And so then, ladies and gentlemen, through the power of editing, one of these days I am going to knock that monitor off the desk and we'll all be very sad. You'll find it very funny, potentially. We are now all set up and ready to go. And I've realized as well that I haven't actually spoken about the way that this thing looks yet. And I'd say on the whole, it looks really nice. I mean, this is one of those chassis that is probably, it was absolutely fine to build in, but especially if you put a lot of stuff in here, it might get a little bit annoying. But the end result, I would say, is worth it. So if you can save yourself a decent chunk of money to say get this case over something that could potentially cost double the price, I think it's not a bad suggestion to go for it, actually, because while it is a little bit cheap in some places, and I don't like the fact you've got this like slightly annoying panel gap at the top, the end result, once you've got everything inside here, is good. And because you do get these RGB fans as standard, it means everybody's build is going to look good rather than just those that like pay money for extra fans and things. I do believe that there's also a button on the top that you can use to cycle through the RGB, and if you want everything to sync up, then you can get it to sync with your motherboard as well, which is pretty nice. But generally speaking, it's an absolutely fine case. I like the fact that it comes with some decent fans as standard, but it's not going to win awards for like the best thing out there. But that's the system as a whole, not too bad. But let's jump in and actually test the gameplay. And I believe we're going to begin our gaming tests with what is a very popular title, and obviously it's the big poster child of everything NVIDIA. This is some Cyberpunk 2077, and we've currently got this set to 4K with DLSS to automatic, and this is set to ultra without any ray tracing or frame gen. And as you can see, we're currently getting around about 75 frames a second or so, which obviously isn't the highest frame rate in the world. But as we're running this at 4K, albeit with DLSS, I think this sort of shows the flexibility, if you like, of this GPU. But I do want to see how this will perform with some ray tracing, as obviously this is the big thing from NVIDIA. So we'll turn this on, we'll get everything enabled, and I think we'll set this to medium. We're not going to use any path tracing or anything like that. Maybe we'll try in a second, but we will turn on DLSS frame generation. And essentially what this does is to render every other frame and then use AI to actually have a frame in the middle, thus in theory giving you up to 2 times the frame rate. But in practice, it doesn't really work that way. It does seem to work quite nicely though as a technology. It's not necessarily going to be like your savior and everything, but in Cyberpunk, it does work really well because as you can see, our frame rate is now actually increased, which is pretty cool. We're all the way up to around about 80 frames a second or so now. But is that a little bit of weird artifacting on the fog? I don't know if that's down to frame gen or whether that is just the game, but yes, you can see something slightly odd going on with the fog there. But before we press on to our next title, I do want to see what happens if you are going to play this at 1440p and whether you can actually have any path tracing enabled. So we're going to set our super resolution now to balanced, resolution down to 1440p, and our frame rate, wow, I actually wasn't expecting it to be that high. Okay, our frame rate's now 126 FPS. I mean, you could actually turn the DLSS up to quality now because you can notice at 1440p that balanced isn't quite so sharp. So let's go with that. And is this going to be the sweet spot for 1440p monitors? I'm inclined to say yes, though the latency is borderline above where I would like it. So maybe if you turn frame gen off, this would be sort of bang on the money. But path tracing, let's have a look. Is this magical setting here? We'll turn that on, jump back into the game, and what does that do? Well, obviously it does lower down the frame rate a lot, but this is where you have to be very careful now, because if you're using a standard frame rate counter, you might think that this looks great, but then you will notice that something is just amiss. I mean, look at this. It's like, it's the frame gen there. Look at that. That's a mist of crap. You do not want to be using that. That is awful. This is just bad. You don't want to be playing like this, even if the lighting and stuff looks a whole lot better. So let's see if we can fix that by turning frame gen off, and we'll see what that does. Well, it certainly fixed that smearing issue, but now your frame rate is around about 50 frames a second or so. And I don't know what it is, but to me, it still doesn't feel quite right. This does not feel, oh, okay, this frame rate's gone down to 40 frames a second. That would explain it. It's smooth, but it's not like response, oh dear. It's smooth, but it's not 60 frames a second smooth. So if you wanted to test this out at, I don't know, dare I say 30 frames a second, play with a controller and cap it, get that console level experience, then fine, but this is absolutely not how I would want to play. So while you can absolutely use path tracing on this, and I suppose, especially if you're playing at 1080p, it'll probably be fine, but your limitations with this are probably like high ray tracing, but not that top tier path tracing that you'd be able to do on something like a 4070 Ti Super. Also, by the way, while I've got you, I do also want to draw your attention to the thing I was most apprehensive about, which are the thermals for the CPU, because I have used small CPU coolers with this chip before, and I was frankly disappointed, but all at like the native stock settings. So I don't think this is with the Intel like default power limit, because I made sure that was off in the motherboard, but it was by default. If you have a look at the thermals at the top right corner of your screen, you'll see we're currently getting around about 50 to 60 degrees on that chip, and this is while the whole system doesn't really make much noise at all. So genuinely, really impressed. That is ridiculous. You don't need to go for anything crazy. The only exception really would be if you want to overclock this really far, or obviously if you're going to use this mainly for productivity, we are not stressing out this chip at 100%. So if you're going to be doing that a lot of the time, probably would make sense to still get a bigger cooler. But if your sole purpose for this is gaming, I think this is going to be great. But let's move across now to a game that is completely different and is one that I genuinely love. I almost certainly know that you guys are bored of me talking about Returnal, but I love it so much, and if you haven't played it, I highly recommend it. And it's one that I love to test because it really does show off what video games can look like. But it's one of those games that actually runs quite well. Like, it's not gonna like overly tax your system, even if you do want to turn ray tracing on. Because what we have here is 4K DLSS performance, ultra settings across the board with ray tracing, and we're still getting 100 frames a second. And this isn't even with like the DLSS 3 frame generation technology or anything like that you can enable if you're struggling for frame rate. But to be honest, as this is such a tight game when it comes to latency, you really do need to be as responsive as possible. I would say that it's probably worth leaving that off unless you absolutely need it, because yeah, 100 frames a second at 4K, fantastic. But obviously if you do want to play at 1440p, then you should be able to get an even higher frame rate. But I know, those are all the single player games.
We want multiplayer, that's all we play.
Well, how about we get started with some Halo? And this is currently running at the high preset, running at 4K. There isn't any like dynamic resolution or anything enabled at the moment. And we're currently getting around about 60 to 70 frames a second. So I wanted to start with this to sort of show you that if you're, I don't know, maybe playing like single player or something like that, then this would be absolutely fine. But obviously there's a lot of tuning you can do to get this to run a whole lot better. Not that 70 frames a second at 4K is anything to be sniffed at. Let's turn this down to 1440p. And as you will see, the frame rate will increase by quite some margin. We're currently looking at around about 110, 105 frames a second now. So still nothing crazy. This isn't like Valorant when you can expect multi-hundreds of FPS. Does that make any sense? I don't know. But regardless, it's still going to be an awesome way to play. If you've got 120 Hz display, you're pretty much going to be saturating this a lot of the time. And if you do want to adjust the settings a little bit more than you can, maybe by turning the resolution down a little bit more, of course, adjusting the quality to medium or something like that. But I'd say this is probably optimal for this system and gives you an idea of what a pretty intense multiplayer title with a lot of visuals will be able to perform like. But enough chitter chatter, let's actually jump out of this plane and show you the frame rate. And I will say that this is the second game I've played, because the first one did seem to be quite stuttery, and I didn't want to say that the PCs were broken or anything like that, because as is quite often the case in big games like this, the very first time you sort of open up a title, you can find that it can misbehave, and then like when you open it up a second time, it's absolutely fine. Fortnite does this as well, but I mean, if it's going to do stuff like that, then obviously that's not a very playable experience at all. But this is currently 1440p set to the extreme preset, and we're currently getting around about 15 milliseconds of latency, about 144 frames a second. But unfortunately, we are still seeing a little bit of stutter here that is quite off-putting. I mean, our 1% lows there went to around about 6 or so. I'm still like fantastic at this game, clearly. But yeah, that is quite annoying. I'm not entirely sure why that is. If you are a Warzone expert, let us know down in the comments section below whether this is just in-game behavior or whether there's something I need to tweak. I mean, I'm going to try and lower this down a little bit to maybe the Ultra preset, which also annoys me. How can you have Ultra be the second best? Why is Extreme the best? If you look at our VRAM, by the way, we're nowhere near that target, so I don't think it's anything to do with that. But let's set this to Ultra. We'll go back into the game and we'll see what that has done to the frame rate and the overall smoothness. Well, our frame rate doesn't seem to drastically be different. We're still looking at around about 140 frames a second or so. Latency is roughly the same, but is the game going to be any smoother? This could also be a case of the more you play again, the more it sort of irons out. But yeah, I'm not happy with this. Not entirely sure what's going on with Warzone there. A little bit frustrating, but this does give you an idea of the sort of performance that, assuming everything works properly, you could get. Because it could just be something to do with this system, this update, this install. I'm not entirely sure. But yes, Warzone doesn't seem to be working exactly the way I'd want it to at the moment. But yes, that's pretty much it actually. On the whole, I would say that this system does work really rather well. It's a very flexible system, and what we've been doing here today is pretty much worst case scenario anyway, because bar Call of Duty Warzone, everything else has been run at 4K, or at least started at 4K, and it shows that for what most people will use, which is probably 1440p or ultra-wide, this is going to be a really great system. I mean, the fact that you get all of those NVIDIA features as well, I think a lot of people are going to love, despite the fact you have to pay a little bit more for the privilege. Just obviously do be aware that this does only have 12 gigabytes of VRAM, so if you are going to do things like path tracing and high resolution, then in the next few years or so you might start to run into some VRAM limitations, but obviously you could just turn the textures down if you do find that this is a potential issue. I think the case itself, it looks great, but there's not really anything particularly about it that I would say is a must buy. And when there are so many cases out there at this sort of price point, I do think that it doesn't do enough to stand out. But bar a couple of I don't know, panel gaps, the fact that the hinge was a bit weird and the lack of cable management grommets, it's not really doing anything wrong, and I think most people will get a really nice build out of this. So if you can get it for a good price, it's recommended, but for 80 quid I'd probably get something else that's in a sale. And yeah, in terms of gaming performance and stuff like that, thermals, acoustics, I think it's pretty much bang on the money. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What do you make of this? Do you like it? Do you dislike it? What should be changed? Let us know down in the comment section below. Smash the like button if you've enjoyed this video. Get yourself subscribed. And if you do want to check out current pricing on anything that was featured in this video, then as always, you can find it listed down below with our Amazon affiliate links. And while you're down there, why not check out NZXT? NZXT's new Lift 2 mouse has arrived, bringing aesthetic class and game-changing performance. Featuring a 26,000 DPI sensor, optical switches, a 60-gram weight and 8,000 Hz of polling rate, this mouse is ideal for fast-paced FPS and relaxing RTS alike. The Lift 2 comes in ergonomic or symmetrical grip styles in both black and white, so there's the perfect mouse for everyone. Grab yours today with the link down below. So thank you so much for watching this video. We'll catch you in the next one.